Hello, everyone, and welcome to Schmidtless Live. I am your host, Kurt Schmidt, president and partner at Foundry, and I'm so excited that you are joining us today. We're going to have a very exciting show because we have the amazing Leilani joining us today. We're very excited. It's going to be great. Before we get jumped into it, which I really want to jump into it because I'm going to learn so much from her today, is that I do have to mention that we are hiring at Foundry. So you check out this, go to that URL thing, and look. If you're not looking for a job currently, well, tell a friend, tell two friends, maybe tell four. You got Thanksgiving coming up. I'm sure you'll see the whole family. You can tell them all that we're hiring. Okay. Is that good? All right. Well, before we jump into it, I just want to mention that, we've got a bunch of great shows coming up. So if you haven't subscribed, make sure you do. Make sure you're following all the stuff because there are going to be some great shows through the rest of the year and into next year. And then we're going to be doing a big book launch show for my book that's coming out in January, which you will find out more about. But before I jump into more of that, which I will later, let's meet Leilani and say hello to her. How are you today, Leilani?
I am great. How are you?
Living the dream. I'm very excited on this Friday.
It's going to be fun. I
It's
always
good.
enjoy our conversations, Kurt.
Yeah. So Leilani, tell the audience, what do you do? What's the work you do, and who do you do it for?
I have the pleasure of being an independent consultant who works with leaders across a whole host of industries with digital transformation and digital strategy. And I get asked often, what does that mean? And I say that it means something different to every company. And so
It
it's
does.
really about meeting the leaders and the organizations where they're at on their digital journey, helping really focus and refine that strategy, focusing on the big rocks and areas of opportunity, and create a plan to be able to make some efficient progress towards it.
That's great. Yeah. Well, and to your point, our topic today is strategy versus tactics, talking about what means different things to different people. Some people think strategy is tactics. Some people think tactics is strategy. We're going to get into all of that. Where I want to start with is can you give us kind of a baseline definition in your mind of what
Mhm.
strategy is and then what tactics are so we can kind of baseline it and then kind of jump from there. Would that be fair?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
I think in a maybe simplified version. So if you think about being strategic or utilizing strategic thinking, it's really keeping the future state in mind of where you want to go as you're taking and
Mm.
defining plans to take action in the near term or near now, next, and later, depending on like the terminology or how you utilize the planning. And tactics are really getting in the weeds around these are the campaigns or the products or the platforms that we're going to build functional teams around and drive forward to help us meet those longer term strategic goals. And so there's
Okay.
that really weedy portion of
Yep.
what do we need to do to get there, but you need to actually set the GPS on your roadmap of where you want to go long term in order to understand how to build those small incremental steps.
Makes sense. Well, and what I've seen as leaders grow is, there's kind of different stages in leadership. There's a very tactical leadership, and then they move into a higher place. But a lot of leaders don't make the switch to more of a strategy leadership position because what got them to where they're at was being very good at the tactical, right? And in a lot of these cases, you've got to play both. You've got to be tactical
Mhm.
and strategic, and find a balance for those. Is that a common thing that you see as well?
I think it is really common. And depending on the organization and the size of the organization, right, they might have different levels of training and development programs or just individual or leadership training opportunities to help make that switch. Because it's really accurate, right? If you're maybe a manager or a supervisor, you're going to be focused on the tactics, right? You're going to be focused really efficiently on what the team needs to get done today or this week or this
Right.
month, and then as you rise in your career, that starts to shift. But I found that there's also a lot of leadership positions where you have to be able to shift back and forth between the two.
Hmm. Yeah. A
And
lot of context switching.
very much so, right?
Yeah.
Depending who you're talking to. Are you managing up? Are you managing down?
Right.
Right. And which portion of the team, or are you talking with your peers as well?
Right. Well, and because it is a it is a leadership sort of skill set, right? And again, when I say leader, I don't mean CEO. It could be a product manager, a project manager. It could be
Yeah.
the lead on a team of a Scrum team. So I want to make sure everybody listening doesn't understands when we're using the term leadership here. We don't mean necessarily just the boss, of the group, right? So and a leader can be a leader without the title as well. So
Definitely.
in these cases, that's where I see people struggling, because what got them there was being good at these metrics. I hit my KPIs, I hit my numbers. And the famous saying, you can't manage what you can't measure, right? So tactics seem safer, right? They seem like a safe place to sit in, because I can always point at the graph going up and to the left or whatever, right? And and that's where I feel like some of the mentality comes in. Do you find that also to be the case?
I think it can. I think the
Yeah,
last 2 years have been actually really disruptive to a lot of that, though,
sure.
because that line on that graph has not just been.
Right.
If you work at Target, right, in a couple of those places that everyone, like, we all had to shop and drive up and pick up our groceries and our toilet paper and everything, especially in the
Hmm.
early part of the pandemic. There were a few industries that grew. There was a lot that did not,
Yeah.
right? A lot that were really lucky just to stay and hit baseline, right, and have
Yep.
no reduction year over year. And so I think that probably was true before 2020. I don't know how accurate that statement is, for a lot of the people that have had to work over the last couple of years. However, over the last 2.5 years in particular, people have had to be very responsive and be in the weeds on that tactical side, because there were so many changes that
Right.
kept coming into organizations and teams at such a rapid pace that it was hard to actually think strategically, because they had to be so reactive.
Yeah. Well, in the other case that I find is and I'm guilty of this myself, Leilani, which is doing things feels like forward momentum, achieving incremental wins, right? Hitting a weekly goal, hitting a monthly goal, hitting a quarterly goal.
Yeah.
Those things they feel like forward momentum, in that they are moving us closer towards the goals that we set. So
Yeah.
how when you're kind of in the whirlwind, how do you pull yourself out of that? Is it is it meditation? Is it what do you suggest people? Some moon water, maybe
Some deep breathing,
charged
maybe.
crystals. I don't know.
Yeah. No. Um, Honestly, you just have to dedicate time to do it. And you will never find time. No one's schedule is just going to magically open up for a week for you
Right.
just to have this blissful time. You just have to be intentional about it. It's similar, and I know you do a lot of coaching about networking, right? Like,
Mm,
no one always has 5 hours a week to
right.
network, right? But if you're invested in your career, and if you're invested in growing your community and supporting your community, there are things that you make time for.
Right.
And as challenging as it can be to get yourself, your team, your leadership group, anyone together to give really focused, thoughtful time towards strategic planning, strategic thinking, just ideation of, like, looking at what is working well for us, and we
Hmm.
think that's a good sustainable baseline, and how do we start thinking about the bigger opportunities and how we start planning out time and dedicating resources towards it, because oftentimes with industries, right, that baseline only lasts for so long, because
Yeah.
we're all being disruptive on
Yeah.
a daily, monthly, annual basis, right? There's new players in the industry, there's changes to regulatory, there's mergers that are happening. And so it's really one of those times where you just have to realize that there's real benefit and value in slowing down that will allow you to actually speed up on the other side.
Yeah. And I think to your point, the bigger your organization gets, the harder it is to do that, because you have so many different people and that have to kind of all start swimming the same direction, if you will, right? So because one of the things that I've seen over and over again is that difficulty to get people to swim in the same direction. So you had mentioned, pausing for a moment and getting people together to talk about why are we here? Why are we doing what we're doing? What has worked? The number one business killer is strategy. Like if you look at every business that has failed since the beginning of time, it is because they didn't have a strategy. Yeah. If you look at the greatest products, right? Motorola was on top of the cell phone world. No strategy. It was just sell more flip phones, So having that strategy is so important, and it seems so obvious, but I've seen when you pull people in a room, how painful it can be for those people, because you're pulling them out of the tactics. You're pulling them out of the things that are moving the business, that feels like it's moving the business forward. And you're telling them to stop doing that for a little while and focus on the bigger picture. I can see why, some people get challenged by that. So how do you frame that conversation, Leilani? How do you broach that? Like, you can't just, well, you can if you're the boss, be like, hey, get in this room for a day, we're doing this, but if you're someone who's more in the mid-management position and you want to pull people in as a product manager to get more insight from sales, more insight from marketing, more insight from development, how do you broach that conversation?
Yeah. I mean, at the very simplest, it's framing up what's in it for them. If you are a product manager or a product team, knowing more about their business and their business goals and what keeps them up at night, what has them concerned, what they're seeing in the industry and in the marketplace, and or what they're really excited about from emerging trends or technology, and allowing them and framing that up to say, you are my strategic partner, and I want to hear more about what you have to share because you have insights and knowledge that I don't necessarily have access to. Mm-hmm. Most people want to share that with you, right? And so I think so much of it's framing. Oftentimes, sessions can just be too nebulous. Be like, we're going to think strategically, or we're going to do strategic planning, but there's no objective. There's no defined roles and responsibilities. There's no how I want you to show up and what I'm expecting from you in those expectation settings.
Right. It's just show up at this meeting, right?
Right. Here's a massive time block on your calendar. And we want you to show up and participate. And by the way, log off your computer, get off Teams and Skype, and we're going to chat. Right. And so I, more often than not, if people are clear on why, like, why are you there? Why are we having this conversation? And how is this information going to be used going forward? Most people, although it is still painful to get the time on people's calendars, when they actually show up in that room, whether it's a virtual room or whether it's a physical room, which I can't lie, I'm always so excited to show up in a physical room with people with whiteboards and sticky notes, which I have all around my home office. It's more fun when you can actually do it. We can be successful both ways. But it is fun to see the energy in the room. And once people get into the exercise and the momentum and the agenda for the day, the energy shifts and is palpable, right? You can see their investment in it. You can see that they're realizing that their voice is heard and valued, right? And when people feel seen and heard and valued, the likelihood of them carving out that time to participate is just going to increase. Now, you still have to do something with it after the meeting, right? You can't have this fantastic, listening session where you're gathering these insights and do nothing with it, because that'll erode trust really quickly. But whether it's with senior leadership or whether it's with product teams or anyone in between, at the end of the day, we're all humans and we all act very similarly in the sense that we do want to have a voice and share what we have to share with one another. And so I think the calendaring can be challenging, but again, if you are really clear and communicate the expectations in the agenda, oftentimes I feel like there's less resistance and more eagerness to participate.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that strategy planning, for example, right? Because there's so many different frameworks out there, Leilani, that people have promoted and pushed and done. If I'm, maybe we've done some strategic sessions, but they haven't necessarily been strategic. They've been like, we're doing a quarterly meeting or something. And and people throw out some ideas and we're like, okay, that sounds like a good goal. Let's do that. Right. But we haven't been as, maybe as intentional with it. Where would you suggest people start? Should they go and take a,
Yeah.
college course on, customer experience design and, where do you start? And where would you suggest people, look for help with that?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of both myself and a bunch of other independent consultants that are really helpful.
Yes. Don't feel like you have to solve all your problems by yourself.
No, I've actually just talked to another senior leader in the last week. We were catching up over coffee, and she was sharing about how challenging it is to lead planning and try and participate in it.
Right.
And so that honestly is one of the biggest tips. Whether you use a consultant or you have someone else in your company that you can lean on, it's really a challenging role to try and shift back and forth and also remain somewhat neutral in that, right? When you're just trying to listen and take it all in those early stages of planning. So having someone that can come in and facilitate can be wildly valuable. And as a leader, it allows you to step back and actually play that participant role, whether you're the product owner or a different, level of leader throughout the organization. So having a defined facilitator can be really helpful. I always like to start with an ideation session so we can think big and broad without the constraints of, what it would take to move these things forward. Regardless of what comes out of that, one, you get an amazing backlog of ideas, whether you choose to pull all or a portion or even just a fragment of one of them forward.
Mm-hmm.
What often happens within that is you identify some really critical next steps where you need to take a deeper dive. And so it's probably pretty easy to tell that I'm not a huge fan of like, we're doing a 3-hour strategic planning and that's all we're doing for the year, right?
We're done.
3 hours, check that box, like we are done.
Yeah.
Generally, when I've seen it work really successfully with the clients that I have the pleasure of working with, it's a multi-month
Sure.
session. Now, that doesn't mean we're meeting every day. That means we're meeting very thoughtfully and intentionally with groups or subsets of leaders. And oftentimes it mimics a lot of some of the human-centered design practices where you have the divergent and, you're kind of flexing and
Yep.
shrinking back the sizes of the groups, right, to ensure we're aligned, but also just going small where you need to go a little deeper. And it helps you identify a lot of dependencies. It helps you realize what needs to happen first because you generally have some natural sequences of where you need to invest, whether it's from people, process, or tech. And so your strategic plan starts to become a little bit more thoughtful and apparent. And then usually by the end, everyone is very well aligned and understanding where we really need to invest to both keep the business running and start to grow and invest in some more either progressive or innovative spaces.
Right. Right. Well, okay. So we got a question from the audience here real quick. I want to bring up. So before defining strategy, how do you explain or define your vision is the question that they have. Right. So in your mind, Leilani, where does that come from? Because we've both probably experienced where you've got the leader that had a dream last night and wakes up and runs into the office and is like, we're going to pivot, we're going to do this. Yeah. Or, a competitor of yours launches a new thing and all of a sudden you've been sideswiped by some innovation or things like that. So how do you, is it up to that leader to kind of call the audible and say, we need to pull back and do this? Where does that come from? And then how do you go about initially defining that so that then you can go into a workshop and say, these are the things we're going to work towards?
For most of the organizations that I've worked both in previous full-time positions as well as worked with, that visioning starts with the senior leadership group. That could be with the board, that could be with the C-suite, depending on like the organization and how big or small they are. And oftentimes that vision then gets refined down into the functional areas of what it means for those functional areas as well. The really interesting challenge comes into play around when senior leadership hasn't fully defined their strategy, meaning directionally where they want to go and where they don't want to go. And the where we don't want to go or invest is just as important, because as these really interesting and or disruptive things pop up in the marketplace, they might be popping up in a space that your leadership team has already decided that they're not going to invest in.
Right.
Right? It brings in too much risk to the organization. And so it's just as important, I think, to communicate what you aren't or where you're not going from a strategic standpoint as where you do want to go. And so when you think about that vision and that enterprise strategy and direction and level setting, I think sometimes the miss is not defining where you're not willing to go or where you're not willing to invest, which I think can help the actual product teams when they see these shiny objects popping up, maybe in the competitive landscape,
Yep.
that would be exciting to go in, but if
they've got a chatbot,
right, you know, or we want to have money movement, and the organization's like, wow, that's a big investment and unique in all 50 states, and we don't want to, it adds too much risk into our organization, right? Like those types of nuances. And so the visioning generally starts from the top and then continues to get refined down to like what it means to you, like in your functional area. And I think re-anchoring to that as you're defining your strategy and your goals can be helpful as like a framing from the enterprise, senior level on down. But if you're unclear about where the organization's unwilling or just sees too much risk in investing in, ask those questions, because I think it can be really helpful, especially for product teams in particular, to know the we're not going to versus, the green space where they're willing to continue to flex and grow and evolve.
Right. And so when I'm suggesting that definition portion, you were saying about preparing people for the event. Is that something you want to share ahead of time, maybe a brief, or what does that look like that you've seen success with?
It can be a couple different ways. And again, it depends on the organization, right? Some organizations are much more formal and they want a lot of documentation ahead of time. Others are a little less formal and just want a really clear agenda and maybe a few, bits of information attached to the meeting invite. And so I think you can be successful either way. It depends on the culture and the team, how well they know one another, how much they trust one another, right? Like, what is that culture you're stepping into?
Mm-hmm.
If it's a much more diverse team that does not have necessarily the relationships, the trust, or the psychological safety with one another just yet, because they haven't worked together long enough or in that capacity, I think a brief, an outline, very clearly defined expectations, timelines, what to expect throughout the day, even as granular as defining breaks, so they know kind of when they can have their pauses, can be valuable because people like to know what to expect. And that brief can be 3 pages or 10 pages, right? It just depends on, it's a little bit of the know your audience and the team that you're walking into.
And so let's talk about the end state, because a lot of people focus, and we get this a lot at Foundry. Our clients focus a lot on, strategy is great, but what are the deliverables? What do I get? What are the, and so you had mentioned, sometimes it can take months to sort of sort out these strategies. How do you handle that as a strategist when maybe what comes out of it is more conversations need to happen, or more definition needs to happen, or you might need to break into smaller groups, or you don't know what you don't know, right? Yep. So how do you manage those expectations as a strategist?
We generally I start with starting a high level timeline of, especially if there's critical dates that we know that we need to adhere to for any amount of reasons. And so we'll set some broad swatches of time, maybe like 2 to 3 weeks, to make progress on certain areas and steps of that strategic process. And then we're always constantly tracking to that timeline, very clearly documenting the progress that was made week over week, where we're at, what additional conversations need to be had, what level of detail and what level of confidence we have at any given time as we're kind of defining and unpacking some of those strategies. Or doing some gap analysis, et cetera. And so for me, it's just really important to be very candid and clear. And or if I receive feedback from any of the leadership around timeline shifting, in that weekly or biweekly meeting with that core leadership group, excuse me, and validating, like, does this still hold true, right? Do we have more time? Has anything moved? Has anything changed? And really kind of re-anchoring to that direction, because with it, like anything, right? Like you could continue to almost go too deep into the details and granularity. And so it's always just a level setting of how much information does your leadership group need to move forward with confidence, and what can we just document as assumptions and or next steps,
Right.
and what level of confidence we have with the information that we've documented. So there's
Yeah.
ways around it.
That and the reason why I bring that up, because I understand what that means, because people are already working. They already got a full-time job. They're already doing things regularly. We do this strategy session, and out comes from it more things to do. So so that's where I see, especially people more in the mid-management level, the more tactical level, like we talked about, where they get concerned, like, well, I already don't have the bandwidth to do what I'm doing. I haven't met a product team that's overstaffed in my career yet. So, I mean, maybe they're out there. If you're out there, leave a comment. Let me know. You might not want to on LinkedIn. Your boss might see it. But if you're doing that sort of work, and you're coming out of it saying, well, I'm going to give you more to do, that can turn people off pretty quickly, right?
Yeah. So a part of strategic thinking and strategic planning is also being really thoughtful about, if you're bringing in and prioritizing new areas to invest in, it's just as important to have candid conversations around what can you stop doing, or maybe refine and do less of, right? Or pause. And so when you're being thoughtful about where you're investing, right? Every once in a while, an organization actually will say, we're just going to stay status quo on this segment or in this line of business because it doesn't have the growth potential, or just not currently growing at the rate of these other segments. And it's, although that can be hard, especially in the Midwest, to hear that, it is one of the best gifts that you can give to your teams, because you are allowing them this space to help prioritize within all of the requests that are coming in, and within all of the tapped out limited resources that are in every single organization. No team has excess time and capacity. It is an absolute gift as a leader to say, we are going to not overinvest in this space. We're going to keep the lights on, or we're going to do, minimum investment. We want to keep nurturing them, but not growing. And so as much as those teams, it can be hard for them to hear, right? If you're a team member that owns that space, just know that like everything, it's an ebb and flow, right? And on the flip side, it might be that it's easier for you to take your PTO and really enjoy some of that time off, right?
Right.
From a product perspective as well. And so I know that that's probably a little disruptive for people in the Midwest to hear, but I've experienced it. And I also encourage leaders to do the same. And it's one of the best gifts that you can give to yourself and to your teams.
Yeah, 100%. So at the last kind of area I want to talk about, I know so many people that are interested in strategy, like as a position, as a job, or a part of their things. And I people keep asking me, like, where do you learn strategy? Where do you go? And I'm like, you could take, I guess you could read some books and things, right? But I think, the real lesson in strategy is, and I see this is experience. You've got to have experience in the thing that you are strategizing about. It's really difficult. I mean, it'd be really difficult for me to strategize about how to open a pizza place. I love pizza. I will eat pizza, but I have no idea like how to make dough or how to buy it and make it huge, right?
Right.
Make enough for like more than just myself and my wife. Like I don't, so I can want to be strategic in all these areas, but it's going to be hard without that experience. So when people come to you, Leilani, and maybe it's a designer, maybe it's an engineer, maybe it's somebody who's like, I want to get more into strategy, what's usually your response?
One, I don't know that most roles are only strategy. I feel like there used to be more titles maybe a decade ago that you were like a strategist, right?
Chief strategy officer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Most roles, it's built into a broader role. It's built into your roles and responsibility. You're a manager, a supervisor, a director, senior director, VP, right? Like C-suite, a product owner, product manager.
Mm-hmm.
There are, like, even for marketing managers, right? And social media managers and leaders and SEO, there's strategy in every single aspect of it. Um, and from a learning perspective, let's face it, Google is immense, right? Like, if you want to just start around with, like, what is strategic thinking, there's so much that you can just Google and learn about. I know that there's LinkedIn courses to be able to take. Sometimes companies have really great internal learning and development teams around how to, be more strategic or employ some of those strategic thinking like frameworks, et cetera. And so I always tell people, instead of just going and saying, I need an MBA, no knock if you have one. I have one as
Yep.
well. I learned a lot there. I learned much more on the job throughout my career. But you don't need to go get another degree is kind of the theme, right?
Yeah.
There's so many different ways that you can just gain access to it. I'm also a huge proponent of raising your hand very loud and proud within your organizations and say, I want to learn more about this. Is there a stretch opportunity for me?
Mm-hmm.
And if I take the stretch opportunity, is there something else you can help me delegate so I can have the time and space to really dedicate to this as well?
Right.
And like primary core area of my job, I've had the pleasure of coaching people into really amazing stretch opportunities, as well as having leaders who helped me do the same. And they were hugely impactful earlier in my career with the stretch opportunities. And so if you raise your hand and say, I want to support this, I want more access, you might be surprised at what you can gain access to just from an experience and exposure standpoint within your own organization. There's a lot of nonprofits out there that will take volunteers.
Yep.
Prepared, right? So like there's a lot of places that you can choose to go to get exposure, but let's face it, Google is just such an easy place to start, as well as LinkedIn Learning.
Yeah, it's well done too. Yeah, no, I love your point. I mean, first of all, my advice is the same as yours, is raise your hand and tell people, because you get 100% of what you don't ask for. So, so, maybe your boss will say no, or maybe you think they will, whatever the case may be. If you don't ask, that's not on you. Your boss isn't wandering around going, boy, how can I stretch this employee today, when, you might have just been complaining to them 2 weeks ago about how you're so busy. So if you're looking for those new opportunities, yes, I 100%, like Leilani said, working with your boss to find those opportunities, or getting them to introduce you to other areas of the business and other bosses that might have special projects or things you can join in on. So, when you hear the word strategy coming up, like, make sure you're raising your hand and figuring out a way that you can, get in on those conversations, even if you're just a fly on the wall, right?
And don't be shy about reaching out to your HR person, right? From your area. They're connected to everyone in the organization.
They are. So
they're going to have access to opportunities and learnings and hearing from other leaders that are maybe strapped themselves. And not to say your boss isn't just as connected with their peers, but depending on the size of the organization, they may not actually have all the connections that your HR person will.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. No, HR is a great place to go. I guarantee it. And they're always the squeaky wheel, so they're good at advocating.
Definitely,
they're good at advocating for you. So, Leilani, thank you so much for talking through this with me today. If I want to reach out to you, if I want to connect with you and learn more about the work you do, where's a great place to find you? Where's a great place to connect with you?
Yeah. LinkedIn, hands down. I welcome any and all connections. It's always fun to meet more people in the community, talk to different leaders, just expand my personal network. And I honestly find so much joy out of continuing to expand my own personal digital network, and always happy to introduce others if they're seeking to grow their own network as well.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and I love the work you do. You have such an amazing reputation, and I thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today and share what you know with all of us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Oh, no, it's all my pleasure. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. That, how can you not? It's just amazing. She's amazing. Definitely connect with Leilani. You can learn a lot just from the things that she posts, the things that she shares. Just a great human being overall. And I thank her so much for taking the time to join us today. So one last thing before I go, did I mention that we are hiring? I did. earlier, but maybe you didn't see it. There it is. Boom, 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 boom. Finger guns. Finger guns. Okay, so go check out that thing. Tell people, go to Thanksgiving, have a great Thanksgiving, because right after Thanksgiving, we got more new shows coming, and it's going to be fantastic. You're going to really enjoy it. So I want to thank you so much again for taking the time to join me today, and we will see you next time.